The river Nile moved like a slow, breathing creature through the heart of Egypt. Its annual flooding, its smell of silt and life, its quiet rippling at dawn. It had shaped the fates of pharaohs and farmers alike. In the summer of 50 BCE, it carried whispers from Alexandria to the farthest fishing villages. The daughter of Ptolemy exiled, Cleopatra, had taken the throne of Egypt. But the throne was never simply inherited in the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was contested, bought, and sometimes drenched in blood. Cleopatra Vesu was only 18 when her father died, leaving her to rule beside her younger brother, Ptolemy Xer, a child of about 10. The will was clear. They would share the throne as co-regents, as Egyptian law demanded male-female dual sovereignty. But Cleopatra, with her fluent Greek and Egyptian, her sharp mind and political cunning, quickly stepped beyond her brother's shadow. In the royal palace of Alexandria, a sprawling structure of marble courtyards, colonnades, and perfumed gardens, Cleopatra began signing decrees in her own name. Coins were minted bearing her face alone. She spoke directly to foreign envoys without the boy king's presence. It was, in essence, a coup conducted through parchment and ink. Among those who noticed this quiet usurpation was Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister. Arsinoe was perhaps 14, still learning the art of royal restraint. She was observant, clever, and, most importantly, ambitious. She watched Cleopatra's ascent not with admiration, but calculation. The Ptolemies were not Egyptians by birth. They were Macedonian Greeks, descended from Ptolemy Isota, one of Alexander the Great's generals who had taken Egypt as his share after the empire fractured. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies ruled as Greek monarchs in an Egyptian land, adopting local customs only when necessary to maintain legitimacy. Incestuous marriages were common, bloodlines were tangled and fraught with rivalry. Sisters married brothers, mothers married sons, and sometimes daughters rose against fathers. Power in Alexandria was not inherited through peace, it was seized through intrigue. Cleopatra knew this well. She had been trained by Greek scholars and Egyptian priests alike, steeped in philosophy and ritual. She spoke multiple languages, and unlike most of her Ptolemaic predecessors, she had learned Egyptian fluently, a decision that earned her both love and suspicion. To the priesthood, she was a goddess reborn, the living Isis. To the Greek aristocracy, she was a dangerous reformer, meddling too deeply with native affairs. Arsinoe's education was less polished but no less potent. She was often kept in the palace's inner quarters, among the tutors who trained the lesser royals. She studied the histories of their dynasty, the betrayals, the coups, the disappearances. She knew, for instance, how her great-grandmother Cleopatra III had imprisoned and killed her own son. She knew that her ancestor Berenice IV had executed her stepmother before being strangled herself by her father's soldiers. Arsinoe understood, even as a child, that in the house of Ptolemy, affection was a luxury few could afford. So when Cleopatra began to assert her power, Arsinoe's young mind absorbed not only the change in protocol, but the potential it carried. A queen who ruled alone could be opposed. A sister who seized the throne might one day be overthrown. Outside the palace walls, Egypt itself was wary. The people suffered under heavy taxation imposed by Cleopatra's father, who had borrowed vast sums from Rome to secure his crown. The Roman Republic's influence loomed over Egypt like a storm cloud. Egyptian grain fed Roman armies, and Egyptian gold oiled Roman politics. When Ptolemy Xer had been exiled years before, it was Roman swords that restored him to power. Now, with Rome divided between the triumvirs Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, Egypt's throne became more than a family dispute. It was a piece in a grander game. The court divided quickly. The eunuch Pothinus, who acted as regent for the young Ptolemy Xer, and the general Achilles, both saw Cleopatra's growing independence as dangerous. To them, she was a woman unrestrained by custom, too bold to be managed. They began plotting to remove her from power, rallying around the boy, king as a symbol of legitimacy. By 48 BCE, the plan was in motion. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria, retreating into the eastern desert near Pelusium, on the edge of Syria. There, she gathered mercenaries, Arab and Greek soldiers, and plotted her return. Arsinoe, meanwhile, remained in the palace. Her relationship with Cleopatra had always been uneasy, but now the distance between them became a chasm. Arsinoe found herself drawn into the orbit of Pothinus and Achilles, who saw in her another potential figurehead, young, royal, and ambitious. In that year, Pompey the Great, once the hero of Rome, was defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus. Fleeing from Greece, Pompey sought refuge in Egypt, expecting protection from the heirs of Ptolemy Xer, his former ally. But the young king's advisors, eager to gain Caesar's favor, decided otherwise. On the shore near Pelusium, Pompey was betrayed and murdered. His head was presented to Caesar upon his arrival in Alexandria. The gesture meant as flattery horrified Caesar. The Roman general, though hardened by years of war, despised treachery against a Roman consul. He entered Alexandria not as an ally, but as a force of judgment. And here, at this moment of tension, Cleopatra made her move. Legend tells that she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled in a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, carried by her servant Apollodorus. When the bundle was unrolled before Caesar, Cleopatra emerged, calm and radiant. It was a theatrical gesture, but one that achieved its purpose. Caesar, impressed by her wit and audacity, sided with her claim to the throne. In the palace, Arsinoe learned of her sister's return with a mix of dread and fascination. The Roman general had shifted the balance. Cleopatra was once again in Alexandria, supported by Caesar's legions. Pothinus and Achillas saw that their time was short. They fled the city, taking Arsinoe with them as they regrouped near Pelusium. There Arsinoe took her first true step into power. The soldiers, disheartened and divided, looked for a leader. Achillas commanded them with skill, but morale was low. Arsinoe, sensing opportunity, began to assert herself. According to the historian Cassius Dio, it was she who ordered the execution of Achillas, accusing him of plotting against her authority. Whether this was a calculated act or a desperate gamble, the result was the same. Arsinoe became the figurehead of the rebellion. From her camp at Pelusium, she declared herself Queen of Egypt. The world had turned upside down. Two sisters now claimed the same throne. One had the support of Rome, the other had the loyalty of the Egyptian army. Between them lay the Nile, wide, patient, ancient. In Alexandria, Caesar fortified the royal palace. He and Cleopatra were besieged by Arsinoe's forces. The once magnificent city was plunged into chaos. Smoke drifted over the harbor. The famed library of Alexandria, filled with scrolls from every corner of the known world, was caught in the crossfire. Flames consumed parts of it, and centuries of knowledge turned to ash. For Arsinoe, it was a moment of triumph and terror. She, barely 17, commanded an army. She was hailed as pharaoh by her soldiers, but within her camp, factions stirred. Some questioned her judgment, others doubted her alliance with Pothinus, who was soon executed by Caesar's order. The politics of war were no less treacherous than those of the court. Still, she persisted. The soldiers adored her courage. The priests spoke her name in the temples of Isis. For a fleeting moment, Arsinoe IV stood as queen, not of marble halls and scrolls, but of tents, spears and dust. But power in Egypt was never permanent. The question that hung over every whispered conversation, every flickering torch in the night, was simple. Could a girl with no army of her own, facing Caesar and Cleopatra together, hold the throne she had seized? And as the smoke of Alexandria darkened the horizon, Arsinoe might have wondered. In the silence between the sounds of war, the winter winds carried the scent of salt and smoke across Alexandria. From the royal quarter to the Canopic Way, the once glistening city had become a maze of barricades and charred ruins. The air was thick with the dust of broken marble and the murmur of soldiers' feet on stone. It was 47 BCE, and the siege of Alexandria had begun. You might imagine it as a grand campaign, massive battles, clashing phalanxes, a roar of trumpets. But in truth, it was slow, exhausting, and, above all, suffocating. For months, the war between the sisters, Cleopatra V and Arsinoe IV, played out in the narrow streets and waterways of a city built for philosophers, not armies. Inside the royal palace, Cleopatra and Julius Caesar were besieged, surrounded by Arsinoe's forces. Caesar's small contingent of Roman troops, around 4,000 men, had entrenched themselves within the palace and parts of the harbor. Arsinoe's army, led by Egyptian commanders who once served her father, encircled them from the west. Each morning, the city awoke to the same routine of monotony and fear. Caesar's engineers reinforced the walls, repairing breaches with whatever they could find. Broken statues, temple stones, even the shattered columns of the Serapeum. The Alexandrians, caught between loyalty and survival, kept their heads low. Cleopatra, in her 21st year, had transformed from a displaced queen into a strategist. She studied the terrain, memorized the city's water routes, and advised Caesar on the politics of the Egyptian factions. The two worked side by side, sometimes through the night, poring over maps lit by oil lamps. Caesar, twice her age, found in Cleopatra a mind equal to his own. She understood, as he did, that war was rarely about the sword. It was about patience, deception, and endurance. Arsinoe, meanwhile, had claimed the eastern quarter of the city and the island of Pharos, where the great lighthouse stood, a marvel of the ancient world, taller than any building in Rome. From there, she commanded the Egyptian navy, watching Caesar's maneuvers from the lighthouse's upper tiers. Her advisors urged her to be cautious, but Arsinoe, barely 17, was impatient for victory. She had already seen too many betrayals, too many men claiming authority in her name. Among her supporters was Ganymedes, a former tutor and eunuch of the royal household. He became her closest confidant, and in practice, the commander of her forces. Ganymedes despised the Romans and Cleopatra alike. It was he who proposed cutting off Caesar's water supply by diverting the canal that fed the palace cisterns with Nile water. It worked. Within days, Caesar's men began to suffer from thirst. The Romans tried digging wells, but the brackish sea seeped into their efforts. The taste of salt water filled their mouths. The morale in the palace began to falter. Caesar's letters from this time, though sparse, hint at the desperation of his troops. In one he wrote simply, "Why fight not against men, but against the elements?" Cleopatra, calm even amid deprivation, advised Caesar to hold his ground. She understood that Egypt's wars were always wars of endurance. When the Nile receded, hunger followed. When the winds changed, sails stilled. Time itself was a weapon, and the one who could wait longest would win. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Arsinoe's army celebrated their advantage. Ganymedes paraded before her tent, proclaiming that Caesar's end was near. Yet victory, as often in history, slipped away in the smallest of details. Caesar ordered his engineers to dig deep trenches to reach underground water sources. After days of labor, they struck a vein of fresh water. The Romans drank again, their spirits restored. The siege continued, each side wary but unwilling to yield. Within the palace walls, Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar deepened. Whether it began as strategy or affection is uncertain, perhaps both. Ancient chroniclers like Plutarch ascribe her charm not as beauty alone, but intelligence and presence. She was, he wrote, irresistible, because conversation with her had an attraction none could explain. Cleopatra knew that alliances sealed in words often lasted longer than those sealed in blood. For Arsinoe, watching from her camp, it must have been infuriating. To her, Cleopatra was no goddess, no rightful ruler, just a sister who had mastered the art of seduction to mask her ambition. Each day the siege dragged on was a reminder that her army, her Egypt, was bleeding for a war that seemed unending. Then came the fire. Caesar, realizing he needed control of the harbor, ordered an assault on the Egyptian fleet. The attack succeeded, but flames spread to the nearby docks and warehouses. The fire leapt from ship to ship, then into the lower city. Wind carried embers to the great library of Alexandria, home to hundreds of thousands of scrolls collected from across the known world. No one is certain how much was lost that day. Some say only a few warehouses burned, others claim the entire library perished in the flames. What is certain is that, amid the smoke and ash, the knowledge of centuries vanished. Words from distant lands, India, Babylon, Athens, turned to dust. And somewhere in the chaos, Arsinoe's soldiers pressed harder against the palace walls. The war had become something more than a dynastic struggle. It was the ruin of a city's soul. For months, skirmishes continued. Caesar's reinforcements, delayed by storms, finally arrived under the command of Mithridates of Pergamon. They marched from Syria toward Egypt, fighting through the delta's marshlands. When Arsinoe's generals heard of this new Roman force, they panicked. Ganymedes ordered a retreat toward the Nile to block their advance. Arsinoe followed, leaving Alexandria behind to oversee the coming battle. There, in the mudflats near the Nile, she faced Caesar's combined forces. Her army still outnumbered his, but discipline was faltering. The Egyptian soldiers, many of them mercenaries, were wary of fighting for royal claimants they scarcely knew. They had seen too many Ptolemies come and go. In the early morning mist, the battle began. Roman ballistae fired stones that shattered Egyptian lines. The Nile, usually calm, churned with debris and bodies. As Caesar's legions advanced, Arsinoe's army broke ranks. She tried to rally them, her voice lost amid the clash of shields and the shouting of orders. Ganymedes fell in the melee, and with him, the last structure of command. By midday, it was over. The remnants of Arsinoe's army fled toward the delta. Caesar, ever pragmatic, ordered pursuit, but spared Arsinoe's life when she was captured. She was brought, bound and silent, before him. For a moment, Caesar regarded the girl who had dared defy him. A 17-year-old who had commanded armies, declared herself queen, and nearly starved a Roman general. Perhaps he saw in her a reflection of Cleopatra's defiance, or perhaps merely another pawn to be moved. Cleopatra, triumphant beside him, said little. It was a victory, but one marred by ash, blood, and loss. Alexandria's grandeur had been dimmed, its library smouldered, its people were wary. and yet Cleopatra stood as queen once more, her rule secured by Rome's sword. As for Arsinoe, she was paraded through the streets of Alexandria, not as a ruler, but as a prisoner. Her name, once whispered with reverence among her soldiers, was now spoken with pity or fear. When Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE, Arsinoe was taken with him. In a grand triumph celebrating his victories in Gaul, Egypt, and Pontus, she was displayed before the Roman crowd, adorned in royal garments bound in chains of gold. It was rare for a woman, let alone a teenage queen, to be included in such a procession. The Roman spectators marveled at her composure, but Cleopatra's allies watched with quiet unease. In that moment, Arsinoe became more than Cleopatra's sister. She became a living reminder, a rival spirit who refused to disappear. And as the triumph ended, with Caesar's chariot rolling toward the capital and the shouts of the crowd echoing through the marble streets, one question remained. When the triumphal parade through Rome ended, the air was still thick with the smell of laurel and incense. Crowds had shouted Caesar's name, garlands had rained from balconies, and musicians had played endless songs of victory. But when the music faded and the torches burned down to embers, there was silence, broken only by the soft creak of the chains that bound Arsinoe of Egypt. She was no longer a queen, not even a prisoner of war. She was an ornament of conquest. Paraded before the Senate, her youth and royal lineage had been reduced to spectacle. To the Romans, she was a living trophy, proof of Caesar's reach into the heart of the ancient world. But for Arsinoe, humiliation was not the same as defeat. She kept her composure, her chin lifted as she walked barefoot through the city of her conquerors. Plutarch tells us that the people of Rome were struck by her dignity. Many pitied her. She was, after all, only 17, the sister of Cleopatra, the woman now enthroned in Alexandria, allied and entangled with Caesar. When the procession ended, Caesar was urged by members of the Senate and priesthood to spare Arsinoe's life. It would be inauspicious, they argued, to execute a woman of royal blood within the sacred boundaries of Rome. Caesar agreed, whether out of mercy or political caution, and granted her sanctuary in the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. And so Arsinoe's exile began. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Situated in Ephesus, on the coast of Asia Minor, it stood as a monument of stone and devotion, its marble columns gleaming under the Anatolian sun, its courtyards filled with worshippers and pilgrims. For centuries, it had been a place of refuge, where even fugitives could claim the protection of the goddess. Within its sanctuary, Arsinoe was given quarters, a modest but dignified life under the watch of the temple priests. She was allowed attendants, though few in number, and her own small garden within the temple's grounds. To most, it would have seemed a comfortable exile, a mercy compared to the execution Caesar had denied her. But for Arsinoe, it was another kind of prison. She was far from Egypt, cut off from the life she had known, from the heat of Alexandria, from the pulse of the Nile. The rituals of Artemis, the hymns at dawn, the perfumed offerings, it was all foreign. Still, she endured. She studied the temple scrolls, learned the ways of the Ephesian people, and slowly became a familiar, if distant, figure among the priestesses. They called her the pharaoh of the sanctuary, half in jest, half in reverence. Years passed. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. Struck down by his own senators in the theatre of Pompey, news of his death reached Ephesus slowly, carried by traders and whispers. Arsinoe listened without visible emotion, though she must have known what it meant. With Caesar dead, Cleopatra's power would falter, or so Arsinoe might have hoped. But Cleopatra, ever the survivor, aligned herself with Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general, and now one of the rulers of Rome under the new triumvirate. Antony, unlike Caesar, was not a man of philosophy or restraint. He was impulsive, proud, easily swayed by passion. Cleopatra, brilliant as ever, turned that to her advantage. From Alexandria, she rebuilt her position, first as Egypt's queen, then as Antony's lover and political ally. Together, they ruled as though reviving the splendor of Alexander's empire, blending Roman ambition with Egyptian ritual. Coins were struck bearing their faces side by side. Lavish feasts were held in the palace. Cleopatra was hailed as the new Isis, Antony as the new Dionysus. And in Ephesus, Arsinoe watched from afar, her bitterness deepening like sediment at the bottom of a still pool. For all her isolation, Arsinoe had not been forgotten. Among Rome's enemies and exiles, her name was sometimes whispered as a symbol of resistance, a rightful queen, wronged by her sister and Rome alike. Her sanctuary at the temple gave her a kind of sacred immunity, and that made her both untouchable and dangerous. Cleopatra knew this. To her, Arsinoe's very existence was a threat. She could not allow her younger sister, who had once commanded Egyptian soldiers and defied Caesar, to remain alive as a living alternative, a rival who might one day draw the loyalty of discontented Egyptians or Roman enemies. By 41 BCE, Cleopatra had traveled to Tarsus to meet Mark Antony. The encounter would become legend. The Egyptian queen sailing up the Cydnus River in a barge of gold and purple sails, perfumed clouds rising around her, Antony captivated from the moment he saw her. Yet amid all the extravagance, there was a quieter, colder discussion, one about Arsinoe. Cleopatra demanded her death. At first, Antony resisted. It was sacrilege to execute someone who had sought refuge in the temple of Artemis, but Cleopatra knew how to bend even the strongest wills. She reminded him of loyalty, of love, of Egypt's alliance. She painted Arsinoe as a danger to their rule, a rallying point for rebellion. And slowly Antony relented. In 41 BCE, under Antony's order, Roman soldiers arrived at Ephesus. They entered the temple precincts, ignoring the protests of the priests. The sanctuary was silent except for the sound of their boots on marble. Arsinoe, realizing what was happening, stepped forward to meet them. No resistance, no pleading, only silence. According to Dio Cassius, she was dragged from the steps of the altar, where she had sought refuge, and executed, her blood staining the white stone of the temple courtyard. The priests were horrified. Even in the ruthless politics of Rome, such an act was a violation. It was said that the goddess Artemis turned her face away that day, her sanctuary defiled by politics and vengeance. Cleopatra's message was clear: mercy was a luxury only the powerful could afford. Arsinoe was gone, but her story lingered. Half legend, half warning. In Alexandria, her name was never again spoken openly. The scribes of the Ptolemaic court erased her from official inscriptions. Cleopatra ruled for another decade, her fate intertwined with Antony's until their defeat at Actium in 31 BCE and their deaths soon after. When Octavian, later Augustus, entered Alexandria, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province, ruled by governors, its queens and kings reduced to history. Yet even centuries later, travelers to Ephesus would speak of the tomb of Arsinoe. Near the temple stood a circular monument, part Greek, part Egyptian in design, bearing carvings of papyrus and lotus. Archaeologists who studied it in modern times found fragments of a skull within, delicate and narrow, belonging to a woman of about 20 years old. Some believe it was Arsinoe, others doubt, but the symmetry of it, the blending of Greek and Egyptian art, seems almost poetic. Two worlds joined in one forgotten grave. In the quiet of that tomb, you can almost imagine her, the girl queen who had once stood against empires, who commanded armies before she came of age, who lived long enough to see her sister worshipped as a goddess and herself erased as a ghost. It is tempting to call her tragic, but perhaps that is too simple. She was, in her own way, a survivor of a dynasty built on betrayal, a figure whose defiance outlasted her years. And though history remembers Cleopatra as the last queen of Egypt, Arsinoe remains its shadow, an echo of what might have been. When you close your eyes and think of the Nile, its waters moving endlessly toward the sea, remember that for every Cleopatra who ruled beneath the sun, there was an Arsinoe standing in the shade, watching, waiting, and refusing to be forgotten. The city of Babylon, around the year 1750 BCE, was a world of dust and order. Beneath the shadow of its towering ziggurat, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, men in long linen skirts pressed wedges into wet clay. Each wedge, each line, each mark was a number, a record, a quiet heartbeat of the empire. You might imagine Babylon as a place of grand kings and mighty walls, and you would be partly right. Hammurabi's code still hung in memory, carved into basalt, proclaiming laws of justice and punishment. But for every decree carved in stone, there were thousands of clay tablets recording far duller things: sacks of barley, measures of oil, rations of beer, loans of silver, wages of temple workers. It was these tablets, millions of them, that truly ran the empire. The scribes of Babylon were not poets or prophets. They were bureaucrats. Their kingdom was the storeroom, the counting house, the narrow chamber beside the temple granary. They sat cross-legged on reed mats, their styluses clicking rhythmically against clay like the sound of rain on stone. It was hot work. The air in the rooms shimmered with dust and incense. A scribe's day began before sunrise, when the city was still half asleep. He washed his hands in the temple basin, recited a short prayer to Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing, and then took his place at the tablet table. Each scribe had a wooden box of tools, his stylus of reed or bone, a sponge for smoothing clay, and a small water bowl to keep the tablets moist. The clay itself came from the riverbanks of the Euphrates, mixed with straw or chaff. It was kneaded until pliable, then flattened into palm-sized slabs. When the overseer arrived, The counting began. 50 gur of barley delivered from Sippar, he would say, and the stylus moved. 3 oxen for the temple of Marduk. The stylus moved again. 1 jar of oil to the household of the governor. The marks accumulated. Triangular impressions, horizontal strokes, small clusters of numbers representing goods that might feed 1,000 mouths. No one spoke much. Words were dangerous things in the bureaucracy of Babylon. Precision was everything, error, a form of blasphemy. The gods themselves, it was believed, kept ledgers of men's deeds, weighing each life against divine order. A careless scribe could bring down the wrath of his overseer, or worse, of Nabu. After each tablet was completed, it was set aside to dry in the sun. Once hardened, it would be stacked in baskets stored in the temple archives. Thousands upon thousands of clay rectangles, arranged by month, year, and office. Many bore the impressions of cylinder seals. Small carved stones rolled across the clay to mark identity and authority. A single seal might show a kneeling figure before a god, a star above, a name inscribed beneath. These were the signatures of power. It is tempting to think of these scribes as men of importance, but in truth, they lived modestly. Their salaries were measured not in gold, but in rations barley, beer oil, and sometimes wool. Their homes were simple mud brick dwellings near the temple precinct. Their prestige lay in literacy, a skill so rare that only a few thousand in all Mesopotamia possessed it. Yet their work touched every part of life. When a farmer brought grain to the temple granary, it was the scribe who weighed it. When laborers built a canal, the scribe recorded their wages. When merchants sailed goods down the Euphrates, the scribe tallied the cargo, and because of these records, Babylon endured. Floods might wash away fields, kings might fall to rival cities, but the tablets remained, baked hard, buried in sand, waiting to be found thousands of years later. 1 tablet, found near the ruins of Sippar, records a day, 5 shekels of silver owed by Sin Edenam, due at the harvest. Another lists temple rations for workers, 2 selah of beer, 1 loaf of bread, 1 measure of oil. It is all so ordinary, so relentlessly practical. And yet, in these dry numbers, the rhythm of ancient life continues. Beyond the temple walls, the city of Babylon hummed with the daily noise of carts and livestock. The markets along the processional way smelled of dates, onions, and fish from the river. Merchants called out prices in Akkadian and Amorite. Women carried baskets on their heads. Children played near the irrigation canals, their laughter echoing against the baked walls. Above it all, the ziggurat rose like a stairway to the heavens, each level smaller than the last, its summit dedicated to Marduk, the city's chief deity. Priests climbed its steep steps to perform rituals at dawn, offering incense and bread to the god of creation. From its highest point, one could see the fields stretching to the horizon, green where the canals fed them, yellow where the water failed. The scribes, though they rarely climbed that high, knew that their work mirrored the order of the cosmos. Each number was a fragment of divine balance, each transaction a reflection of celestial accounting. They did not fight wars or build monuments, but they maintained the equilibrium that allowed kings to rule. And yet beneath the quiet surface of record-keeping, the seeds of tension always grew. Inflation, yes, even then, crept into the price of grain. A poor harvest in the north meant the temples demanded more from the south. Debt piled up, and farmers lost their land to creditors. It was the scribes who saw it first, in their tablets barley measures that stretched thin, silver debts that multiplied. They did not speak of it, they simply recorded. But in those marks of clay, the future downfall of Babylon was already taking shape. For empires do not collapse in a single day of conquest. They erode slowly, through ledgers and shortages, through miscalculations and forgotten debts. And as the sun sank behind the ziggurat, the scribes of Babylon set aside their styluses, stretched their stiff fingers, and looked out toward the fading light. The Euphrates shimmered in the distance, carrying the reflection of the temple's shadow across the water. They had done their duty. Tomorrow, they would count again. But perhaps one of them wondered, as he washed the clay from his hands. The morning sun crept slowly over the baked rooftops of Babylon, warming the courtyards where clay tablets lay drying in neat rows. The scribes of the temple bureaucracy arrived before the markets opened, moving with quiet familiarity through the long corridors of the record rooms. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, thick with the smell of dust, lamp oil, and centuries of administration. It was not a glamorous life. The scribes were the unseen machinery of empire, those who kept the lists, balanced the weights, and remembered what others forgot. Their domain was not the battlefield or the throne, but the archive. And yet their control over the city's pulse was absolute. Everything in Babylon had a measure, a number, a price. A man's labor was measured in days, a field in IQ, a grain shipment in gur. Even the gods were accounted for, temple offerings tabulated, sacrifices scheduled with precision. The bureaucracy left nothing unrecorded. But beneath this order, the empire's economy was shifting. The harvest and the tablet once each year, after the great flood of the Euphrates receded, the scribes and temple overseers went out to the fields. Their task was to measure the yield of barley, the crop that sustained both life and the state. They carried tablets, reed styluses, and measuring cords. Under the pale glare of the sun, they walked through the stubble and dust, counting stalks, calculating harvest shares, and determining what portion belonged to the temple and what remained for the farmers. One such scribe, whose name survives on a clay tablet now in the British Museum, was Ibn Shamash. He worked under the authority of the Temple of Marduk and oversaw grain accounts for a district near Kish. His handwriting, rows of wedge-shaped impressions, was careful, consistent, almost beautiful in its geometry. His job was to ensure that every gur of barley owed to the temple was delivered, stored, and recorded. The tablet that bears his name reads, in translation, barley received from the field of Sin Erebam, 10 gur, good measure, delivered to the storehouse of the temple. Witness Ibn Shamash scribe. Simple words, but they reveal the structure that kept Babylon alive. When the farmers brought their harvest, they also brought their debts. The temple loaned seed grain in spring and demanded repayment after harvest with interest, often 1/3 of the yield. In good years this system worked. In poor years it crushed. When the floods came late or the locusts too early, the yield failed. The farmers could not pay. Their debts rolled over to the next year, then the next. Eventually, land changed hands, from farmers to temple estates, from small holders to wealthy merchants. The scribes wrote it all down line by line, in unbroken obedience to the rules of administration. For the scribes, it was not their place to question the fairness of numbers. The tablet spoke truth. Their duty was to make the world align with it. But behind the quiet routine, the clay told stories of strain, of families selling their children into indenture, of farmers abandoning their fields, of temples accumulating more land than they could till. In one archive, archaeologists later found a tablet that reads, "One child pledged as security for a loan of 3 shekels of silver." It was signed by witnesses, sealed by the borrower, and stamped by the temple official. The bureaucracy had no room for sentiment. It was as cold and precise as the clay it wrote upon. The flood of records, as the empire grew, so did its paperwork. The archives swelled beyond measure. Rooms filled with tablets stacked in woven baskets, each tagged with a clay label identifying the year and office. The scribes used wooden shelving to hold them, though fire and dampness were constant threats. The temple of Shamash in Sippar was said to hold over 30,000 tablets, each one a fragment of the city's life. When old records were no longer needed, they were not destroyed. They were buried, sealed in clay jars, stacked in forgotten chambers beneath the ziggurat. It is from these neglected vaults that archaeologists thousands of years later unearthed Babylon's secrets. And through them, we can still read the monotony of empire. 2 donkeys rented for the journey to Ur. 1 pot of beer issued to laborers digging canal number 12. Account of fish delivered to the governor's house. Each line seems trivial, yet together they reveal a civilization built on detail. The scribes of Babylon did not see themselves as historians. They wrote for the present moment, for the tax season, the temple, the king's ledgers. But inadvertently they became the first true historians. Their clay survived where bronze and wood decayed. In that survival lies an irony. The men who recorded every crumb of daily life left behind almost nothing of their own. We do not know what Ibn Shamash looked like, whether he was tall or short, kind or severe. We know only his handwriting, his seal, and the precision of his work. The silver problem. By the time Hammurabi's descendants ruled Babylon, silver had begun to replace barley as the standard of value. It was easier to transport, easier to divide, and more flexible in trade, but its use introduced uncertainty into a system built on tangible goods. Barley could be counted and stored, silver could disappear. The scribes had to learn new methods of calculation. They tracked loans in both weights and equivalents, how much silver equaled a gur of barley, or a worker's monthly wage. Prices fluctuated with the harvest, the flow of trade, the whims of distant merchants. One surviving tablet records a debate between scribes about the correct exchange rate of silver to grain. The disagreement, though seemingly trivial, reveals a system under stress. When silver values rose, farmers could no longer afford repayment. When they fell, creditors suffered. The scribes, caught between both sides, were forced to improvise rules that would satisfy neither completely. And through it all, they kept writing. Each transaction was a small attempt to impose order on chaos, to measure the immeasurable, to give weight to trust and time. But as the empire aged, its ledgers grew heavier, its bureaucracy slower, its justice more abstract. The very precision that had made Babylon strong became its burden. The quiet revolt of the numbers. Every so often, a king would proclaim a misherim, a general debt cancellation. It was both mercy and necessity, a way to reset the balance when too many fell into bondage. At the sound of the royal decree, scribes would enter the archives, find the tablets of old debts and break them. The cracking of clay echoed through the record halls, a dry, brittle sound, like wind snapping reeds. Farmers cheered, merchants grumbled, scribes worked late into the night, revising accounts, recalculating temple shares. The bureaucracy reset itself, if only for a while. Such decrees preserved peace, but they also revealed fragility. When an economy requires periodic erasure to survive, something beneath its numbers is deeply broken. The scribes, though loyal, must have sensed it. Their lives depended on stability, on the endless repetition of routine. But they could see the fluctuations, grain shortages, corrupt overseers, debtors vanishing into the countryside. They could feel the tremors beneath the neat columns of their tablets. One might imagine an old scribe, perhaps Ibn Shamash himself, sitting late by lamplight, pressing his stylus into wet clay, pausing now and then as he looked toward the open window. Outside, the wind carried the scent of river water and smoke from the city's kilns. He would glance at the line of numbers he had just written and wonder whether any of it truly captured the truth of things. Did the marks on clay represent wealth, or simply a dream of control? He could not ask such questions aloud. The temple demanded silence. The tablets demanded completion. But perhaps, as he dried the day's last record and set it aside, he thought of the floodwaters that would one day come again, washing away fields, drowning the harvest, erasing the debts that had consumed men's lives. And perhaps he smiled, faintly, at the irony that the same river which brought life also cleansed the ledgers of empire. The next morning, the scribes returned as always, their sandals scraping softly across the stone floors. The same prayers murmured, the same tools arranged. The empire endured another day, balanced on numbers, faith, and the silent patience of men who knew that their work would outlast their names. When you walk today through the ruins of Babylon, there is little sound but the wind. It moves through the cracked mud, brick walls, and over the remnants of foundations where offices once stood. The city that had been the beating heart of an empire built not on conquest, but on calculation, lies buried beneath centuries of sand. But if you listen closely, the silence is not empty. It hums with memory, the whisper of styluses pressed into wet clay, the murmur of scribes dictating accounts, the rhythm of numbers keeping time with the sun. Babylon may be dust, but its bureaucracy endures in spirit. Before the fall, the city had reached a level of administrative sophistication unmatched in the ancient world. It was not merely a place of kings and temples, it was a machine calibrated to measure every loaf of bread, every canal dug, every shipment of grain. In the centuries following Hammurabi's reign, Babylonian scribes had refined their system until it could manage both empire and eternity. The clay tablets were their language, their law, their memory. The archive of eternity. In the final centuries of Babylon's dominance, the archives had become more than mere storerooms. They were monuments. Entire wings of temples and palaces were dedicated to record keeping. A single provincial governor might maintain dozens of clerks, each assigned to a specific task: grain tallies, tax receipt, labor rosters, and temple offerings. To the outside observer, it must have seemed excessive. Thousands of tablets recording the same cycles of life year after year. Yet, to the Babylonians, this repetition was divine. Order was sacred. The gods themselves were thought to favor balance, measure, and truth in record-keeping. It was said that when Marduk created the world, he assigned everything its number, its name, and its portion. The scribes merely followed that divine example. A clay tablet from the reign of Nabonidus, Babylon's last king, still carries this echo of devotion. May the gods remember me for the accuracy of my accounts. To be a good scribe was to participate in cosmic order. Each sign pressed into clay was a small act of alignment with eternity. But even eternity can decay. The fraying of the ledger by the late 6th century BCE, Babylon was no longer the center of the world. New powers had risen in the east. The Medes, the Persians. Cyrus of Anshan, a king of modest origins, began to conquer his neighbors. He moved with swiftness and strategy, absorbing lands that once paid tribute to Babylon. Within the temple archives, the scribes noted these changes with the same detachment they brought to harvest reports. In their ledgers, a conquered province was a column of adjusted tribute, a recalculated flow of grain and silver, but beneath the neat writing a sense of uncertainty crept in. For the first time in centuries, the temple administrators found themselves unsure of what tomorrow's world would look like. Would their records still matter if Babylon fell? Would their gods protect them, or had divine favor already shifted toward this rising Persian star? Still, they kept writing. The clay had no room for doubt. When Cyrus's army approached Babylon in 539 BCE, the city was neither destroyed nor burned. According to Babylonian chronicles, the gates were opened peacefully. The priests of Marduk even welcomed Cyrus, proclaiming that he was chosen by the god himself. In the archives, the scribes dutifully recorded the event. In the month of Tashritu, when Cyrus entered Babylon, peace was established. No spear was raised. It was perhaps the quietest conquest in history, and yet in that silence an era ended. The scribes under Persian rule, the Persians did not dismantle the Babylonian bureaucracy. On the contrary, they depended on it. The same scribes who had served under Nabonidus now served Cyrus. The same ledgers continued. The same clay tablets were inscribed, only now the headings bore a different royal name. But something subtle shifted. Where once the scribes had worked in the service of gods and temples, now they worked for an empire of men. Persian administrators valued efficiency more than ritual. Silver replaced barley almost entirely as a unit of exchange. Local temples still functioned, but they no longer dictated the rhythms of the economy. The Babylonian scribes adjusted, but uneasily. The new system required written letters, reports, and correspondence on parchment and leather, materials faster to write but far less enduring than clay. To the old clerks, this felt like heresy. One imagined scene, preserved in a rare tablet from the Persian period, captures the tension perfectly. To the royal scribe Bel, Adin, your report on the silver accounts is delayed. The new method must be followed. Use parchment for speed. Parchment for speed. Clay was too slow for empire. And so, the Babylonian scribes, those guardians of permanence, found themselves working in a world that valued haste over endurance. Their craft, perfected over 2 millennia, began to fade into obsolescence. Some continued to write on clay out of habit of faith. Others adapted reluctantly to ink and papyrus. But with each generation, fewer remembered how to mix the right consistency of clay, how to dry a tablet without cracking, how to incise the wedge strokes with proper depth. By the time of Darius I, barely a century after Cyrus's conquest, the old archives were already relics. The silence after the scribes, and yet the clay endured. When the palaces fell, when the libraries crumbled, when the parchment rotted and ink faded, the clay survived beneath the soil. Every broken tablet, every fragment of cuneiform, lay waiting. Thousands of years later, in the 19th century, European archaeologists, digging through the ruins of Babylon, Sippar, and Uruk unearthed the forgotten heart of that ancient bureaucracy. The tablets emerged like ghosts, mute but eloquent. There were records of wages, letters to kings, receipts for temple beer, even personal notes. Tell my brother to bring my sandals from Kish. The discovery astonished scholars. Civilization, it turned out, had been more administrative than heroic. The first true monuments of human thought were not poems or epics, but tax receipts. Among the finds was a small, unassuming tablet. It recorded a delivery of barley, 10 gur, measured, verified, and sealed. The same formula written by Ebni Shamash nearly 1500 years before Babylon's fall. The handwriting was the same careful geometry, the same devotion to detail. The name of the scribe was different, but the hand felt familiar, as though the ghosts of Babylon's bureaucrats had continued their work long after their city was gone. Legacy of the clay, the influence of Babylon's record, keeping alive the city itself. The Persians borrowed its administrative structures. The Greeks, under Alexander, used Babylonian methods to track their conquests. Even the Romans, centuries later, inherited the same obsession with census, tribute, and written order. Our modern paperwork, the endless forms, the signatures, the stamps, all descend from those ancient ledgers. The same desire to define, to measure, to fix reality into words. And in a sense, we are still living in Babylon. We still build our empires out of records, still measure life in columns and accounts, still believe that if we can write it down, we can control it. But perhaps the scribes knew something we have forgotten. They worked not to conquer time, but to bear witness to it. They understood that every tablet, however small, was a fragment of eternity. And they must have known, as they pressed their styluses into the clay, that someday, even if the city fell, even if the empire vanished, someone, somewhere, would read their words again. Perhaps that was the real power of the bureaucracy, not control, but continuity. When you picture the last Babylonian scribe, sitting alone in a room filled with crumbling tablets, you can almost see him pause before inscribing the final line. His hand trembles, not from fear, but from fatigue. He looks out the window, where the dust rises in the orange light at evening. He presses his stylus one last time and writes account completed. Year uncertain. Then he sets the tablet aside and waits for the clay to dry. Outside, the wind carries the scent of the Euphrates. Inside, the empire of numbers quietly ends, not with conquest, not with fire, but with silence. If you were to wake one morning in ancient Rome, say, in the year 110 CE, you would hear the sound of water long before you opened your eyes. It was everywhere, woven into the city's rhythm. Fountains gurgled in courtyards, cisterns dripped in cool darkness, and the great public baths steamed like miniature oceans. Rome was a city built on water, but the Tiber, sluggish and brown, could not have sustained its 1,000,000 inhabitants. The secret lay beyond the walls, in the long, silent arches that cut across the countryside, the aqueducts. They were Rome's lifelines, channels of precision, carrying clean water from distant hills to the heart of the empire. Each drop that reached a Roman home had traveled for miles, through tunnels, stone bridges, and vaulted conduits, all designed and maintained by engineers and laborers whose names were rarely remembered. The emperors took credit, of course. The Aqua Marcia, Aqua Claudia, Aqua Traiana, these were monuments to imperial vision. But behind the inscriptions and triumphal dedications were generations of men who spent their lives inside damp tunnels, scraping lime from the walls and measuring the gradient of a channel by candlelight. This is their story, the quiet story of the water bringers. The origins of the flow. The Romans did not invent the aqueduct. The Etruscans before them had already mastered underground drainage, and the Greeks had built conduits of clay pipe and stone. But the Romans perfected the art of moving water on a scale the world had never seen. The first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was begun in 312 BCE by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, the same man who built the Via Appia, Rome's first great road. At the time, Rome was still a small city-state surrounded by rivals. The Aqua Appia ran mostly underground, both to protect it from sabotage and because early Roman engineers were cautious about high arches. Its source lay in springs about 10 miles from the city. The water flowed through a narrow, vaulted tunnel, sometimes carved directly through limestone, sometimes lined with tufa blocks sealed with mortar. The channel was so narrow that only one man at a time could crawl through to inspect it. When the water first reached the city, the Romans celebrated with sacrifices to the river gods, but the flow was modest, barely enough for a few fountains and public basins. Yet it was a beginning. Over the next 5 centuries, the network grew like veins spreading through a body. Each new aqueduct extended farther into the hills, seeking purer, colder sources. By the time of Emperor Trajan, Rome was fed by 11 aqueducts, carrying nearly 300 million gallons of water per day. The geometry of water, the genius of the aqueduct, was not in its materials but in its mathematics. Roman engineers understood a principle that would shape all future civilizations. Water flows best when it barely seems to flow at all. The ideal gradient was 1 part in 4800, about 7 inches of drop per mile. Too steep and the water would erode the channel, too flat and it would stagnate. To maintain this delicate balance across miles of uneven terrain, the curators aquarum, Rome's water commissioners, relied on an array of tools: the chorobates, a long leveling beam fitted with water channels for horizontal alignment, the groma for surveying straight lines, and the humble plumb line, whose weight determined the fall of the channel through hills and valleys. The result was a miracle of consistency. From the spring to the city gate, the water descended almost imperceptibly, carried by gravity alone. Most of the road lay underground, vaulted tunnels sealed with opus signinum, a waterproof mortar of lime and crushed pottery. Where valleys interrupted the road, engineers built arched bridges, rows of graceful stone arcades that still stand today, like frozen rivers of masonry. The most famous of these, the Pont du Gard in southern Gaul, towers nearly 160 feet above the Garden River. Its upper tier carried a narrow channel no wider than a man's shoulders, yet it could deliver 10,000 gallons of water every hour. The precision is astonishing even now. Modern engineers who have studied its gradient found it to drop only 34 centimeters across its entire 900-foot span, so slight that the eye can hardly detect it. The men beneath the arches, the aqueducts, may have been designed by magistrates and celebrated by emperors, but their true keepers were the aquarii, the water workers. These men, often slaves or freedmen, spent their lives maintaining the unseen arteries of Rome. They descended into inspection shafts to remove silt, repaired cracks in the lining, and cleared calcium deposits that grew like coral on the channel walls. The work was constant. A single blockage could stop the flow for an entire district. To prevent contamination, the Romans forbade burial or agriculture near the Specis, the water channel. Still, breaches occurred. Roots from fig trees were especially destructive. Their tendrils could pierce stone and split mortar. Rats and snakes sometimes fell into the flow, causing foul smells and superstitious panic. The curator aquarum, a position of high prestige, was responsible for the entire system. By the 1st century CE, this office was held by senators. Under them served hundreds of equari, technici, and liberati aquarum, freedmen who supervised labor. Their duties were listed in the Lex Quinctia, a law from 9 BCE that set penalties for damage or theft of water. Even drawing too much from a public fountain could incur fines. Rome's water was state property, both a luxury and a symbol of imperial control. The city of water within the city, the aqueducts ended in castella aquae, distribution tanks where water was divided into lead pipes, fistulate feeding fountains, baths, and private homes. The water pressure varied with elevation. The wealthy, living on the hills, often had poorer supply than the plebeians in the low districts. At night, when the baths closed and the fountains slowed, the water still ran, washing the streets, feeding ornamental pools, cooling the air. The constant sound of trickling water became part of Rome's identity, a background hum of civilization. In his natural history, Pliny the Elder called the aqueducts the most magnificent of all the works of the Roman people. He was not wrong. They represented more than engineering. They were a philosophy of permanence. To bring water from the mountains to the city was to master nature itself. But the miracle came with monotony. Day after day, teams of equari walked the same roads, checked the same conduits, scraped the same deposits. Their world was measured in inches and angles, in the slow erosion of stone and the patience of repair. They worked by torchlight in narrow tunnels, hearing the steady whisper of water echo through the dark. For them, empire was not marble and triumph, it was maintenance. The endless work by the time Trajan ruled, the aqueducts were already ancient. The Aqua Appia had been running for 400 years. Parts of its channel had collapsed, others had silted up entirely. Repairs were endless. Each spring, when the rains ended, maintenance crews were sent out to inspect the sources and conduits. Records from the curator's aquarium show lists of routine tasks. To clean the settling tank at the 8th milestone, to rebuild the wall at the arch near Fidenae, to repair the sluice near the farm of Lucius Cornelius. Nothing heroic, just small necessary acts repeated endlessly. The Romans understood something profound. Civilization depends not on brilliance but on upkeep. Every stone must be checked, every channel cleared, every measurement verified. The grandeur of Rome was not sustained by conquest alone, it was sustained by plumbers. The water of time, and so, day after day, the water flowed. Through arches and tunnels, through the countryside and into the marble fountains of Rome. You can imagine standing near the Aqua Claudia on a quiet morning, the sunlight striking the high arches, a soft hiss of wind moving through the gaps. The water inside moves too, unseen but ceaseless, carrying the reflection of the sky into the heart of a city that believed itself eternal. The aqueduct builders did not know that Rome would one day fall. They only knew that stone, properly set and tended, could outlast kings. Their legacy remains not in monuments of war or law, but in every drop of running water we take for granted today. But one must ask, when the last mason set down his trowel and the final drop reached the city, did he ever wonder whether the empire itself could endure as long as the water he had made flow? The aqueducts of Rome were not just monuments of engineering, they were instruments of routine. Behind the graceful arches and glittering fountains lay a system of labor so intricate and constant that it blurred the line between order and obsession. The water did not stop. Therefore, neither could the men who kept it moving. The endless inspection at dawn, the equari, Rome's water workers, began their daily rounds. They moved along narrow service paths beside the conduits, some running underground for miles. Each man carried a bronze lamp, a hammer, and a small wooden rod marked with measurements. They checked for cracks in the plaster, signs of leakage or discoloration in the flow, evidence of contamination. If a fault was found, the section was isolated with temporary barriers, and the repair began. The air inside the tunnels was humid and stale, thick with the smell of lime and algae. Water whispered along the channel, its sound amplified by the vaulted stone. In these dark spaces, time seemed to slow. Pliny the Younger once remarked that the aqueducts, require more care than admiration. He was right. The grandeur of the arches visible above the countryside was deceptive. 90% of Rome's water traveled unseen, hidden in channels of brick and stone. The equerri spent their lives within those hidden arteries, crawling, cleaning, and measuring. The arithmetic of maintenance. The Roman water administration was one of the most organized institutions of the empire. Its head, the curator aquarum, often a senator, commanded a staff of hundreds inspectors, curatores, technicians das architecti, plasterers tectorus, and repair crews fabri aquari. Every repair was logged in official ledgers. One such document, discovered on bronze tablets at the site of an aqueduct near Tivoli, listed expenditures for lime, lead, and stonework, for 20 feet of channel restored, 6 sesterces for lime, 8 for stone, 12 for labor. It reads more like an invoice than a monument. But that was Rome's genius. It made administration an art. To finance such a system required taxes, of course. Every fountain, every bathhouse, every private home with its own pipe paid for the privilege. The vectigal aquarum, the water tax, funded repairs and wages, yet the bureaucracy itself could leak as badly as the conduits. Corruption was not uncommon. Some equerri diverted water illegally to private estates, installing secret junctions known as clandestine fistulae. Wealthy landowners paid bribes to increase their share, while poorer districts sometimes went dry. Frontinus, who served as curator aquarum under Emperor Nerva, wrote an entire treatise cataloguing these abuses. His tone was wary but precise, the voice of a man trying to impose order on a system that refused to stay still. Many pipes, he wrote, are inserted without right or measure. Water, intended for the people, flows instead to private fountains and gardens. His solution was simple but exhausting: inspect everything, record everything, repair everything. In Rome, even water required surveillance. The world beneath the city, the deeper one, descended into the aqueducts. The more the city above seemed to disappear. Some tunnels ran 30 or 40 feet underground, cutting through layers of volcanic tufa. They were entered through putae, vertical shafts spaced at regular intervals along the route. These openings provided air, light, and access for maintenance. For the men who worked below, the shafts were their only connection to the surface. Through them, the sky appeared as a narrow circle of blue far above. The sound of hammers on stone echoed like distant thunder. When repairs required draining a section, the water was diverted through side channels, leaving behind a slick residue that clung to boots and tools. The men worked in near darkness, guided by the flicker of oil lamps. They sang to keep rhythm while plastering the walls. A low, steady chant that mixed with the gurgle of trickling water. It was not worship exactly, but something close. No inscription records their names. Their work left no statues, no poetry. Yet, each stroke of mortar, each measured line, was part of the pulse that kept Rome alive. The water's path. To understand the scope of the Roman aqueducts, one must follow the flow. From the distant springs, the water passed through a series of basins called piscinae limaria, where silt settled before the clean flow continued onward. These were often hidden in small stone chambers, fitted with sluices to drain sediment. From there, the water traveled through covered conduits, crossing valleys on arches or entering tunnels cut through hills. Every few miles there was an inspection shaft, every 10 or 20 a redistribution basin. At the city's edge stood the grandest structure of all, the Castellum Divisorium, the distribution tower. From the Castellum, the water was divided into 3 streams: public supply for fountains, baths, and latrines; imperial use for palaces, gardens, and military installations; private supply for citizens granted access by imperial decree. The lead pipes that carried the flow were stamped with the owner's name, a primitive form of licensing. Archaeologists have found thousands of such pipes bearing inscriptions like Domus Caesaris, the house of Caesar; Lucius Cornelius Balbus, property of Lucius Cornelius Balbus. Each name represents privilege, an invisible hierarchy written into the city's plumbing. Even in water, Rome preserved its social order. The taste of power. Clean water was a luxury few ancient cities could sustain. In Athens, wells dried in summer; in Alexandria, canals silted up; in Jerusalem, cisterns turned brackish. Rome, by contrast, boasted fountains on nearly every street. The abundance was intoxicating. The baths of Caracalla, built a century later, consumed an estimated 10 million gallons of water a day, more than some modern cities. To bathe was not merely to wash, it was to participate in the rhythm of empire. The baths were places of exercise, gossip, business, and ritual. Steam rose through vaulted halls, mingling with the scent of oils and flowers. The marble floors gleamed with reflected waterlight. All of it, every drop, every shimmer, was fed by the work of men who labored unseen beneath the city. Yet the Romans rarely acknowledged them. The builders of triumphal arches were honored with inscriptions. The equari were paid in denarii and forgotten. Still, their work persisted, unending, uncelebrated. The creep of decay by the time of Hadrian, the aqueducts were showing their age. The Aqua Marcia, built in 144 BCE, had sections worn thin by erosion. The Aqua Virgo, which supplied the Campus Martius, was often filed by runoff from nearby farms. The lime deposits known as sinter built up inch by inch, narrowing the channels like arteries clogged with stone. The equari fought back with chisels and vinegar. They scraped, patched, and plastered endlessly, but nature was relentless. The water they carried, pure, cold, constant, was also the very force that eroded the empire's arteries. In time, new emperors preferred to build rather than maintain. They commissioned grand baths and new fountains, while older conduits fell into neglect. Maintenance, once sacred, became mundane. Frontinus lamented this trend in his reports. Men praise what is new, yet forget that what is old sustains them. His words were prophetic. The philosophy of flow, the Roman aqueducts were more than infrastructure. They were a reflection of Rome's worldview. Water was power, but also duty. The state existed not to inspire awe, but to maintain continuity. To keep the flow steady, the pipes clear, the fountains running. There was no end point, no final triumph, only routine. Perhaps that is why the aqueducts feel so modern. They embody the same paradox we live by: progress that demands constant maintenance, civilization dependent on invisible labor. As you imagine a worker deep inside a tunnel, wiping sweat from his brow, the torchlight flickering against damp stone, consider that he was not building glory. He was simply keeping things running, ensuring that the empire, for one more day, would not run dry. The water of Rome flowed for nearly 1,000 years after the first channel was dug. Long after emperors died and temples crumbled, the aqueducts continued to carry their quiet rhythm through the hills. But no system can flow forever. And when the maintenance faltered, when the channels cracked, when the taxes fell short, when the empire's borders began to shrink, what would happen to a civilization whose greatness depended not on conquest, but on upkeep? The Roman aqueducts had once been the quiet miracle of the ancient world, streams of stone and gravity that whispered through the hills and valleys of empire. They required no prayer, no sacrifice, no machinery, only labor. And when the labor stopped, so did the miracle. This is the story of what happens when the water slows. The empire weakens. By the late 4th century. The empire that had once built roads, amphitheaters, and aqueducts stretching from Britain to Syria was no longer what it had been. Frontinus's meticulous ledgers and the discipline of the curator aquarum had given way to neglect. The water continued to flow, but with less oversight. Funds once allocated to lime, stone, and repair crews were diverted to military defenses, or simply disappeared into the private coffers of corrupt governors. The aqueducts still stood, arched silhouettes across the Campagna, but the men who maintained them were fewer now. The equari, who had once numbered in the hundreds, dwindled to dozens. Their tools rusted, lime was scarce, some channels ran dry. The Aqua Marcia, famed for its cold, clean water, developed leaks near Tivoli. Entire sections of the Aqua Claudia collapsed in the Sabine hills, leaving towns parched. In the city, fountains sputtered. The baths still steamed, but less often. Citizens complained that the water no longer reached the upper floors of their homes. The empire's decay was not sudden. It was slow, silent, and steady, much like lime accreting on stone. The Gothic siege in 537 CE, the city of Rome came under siege by the Ostrogothic king Vitiges. The aqueducts, once sources of life, became strategic liabilities. Vitiges knew what the Romans had always known: water was control. He ordered the aqueducts cut. In a single calculated act, channels that had carried water for 7 centuries were deliberately destroyed. The Aqua Claudia and Aqua Aeneo Novus were breached, their flow diverted into the countryside. The sound of running water, a constant hum in the Roman air, was replaced by silence. Inside the city, panic spread. Wells were shallow, the Tiber too full to drink. Citizens lined up at cisterns, rationing what little remained. The once grand baths of Caracolla and Diocletian stood cold and empty. The marble that had gleamed with moisture now gathered dust. Procopius, the historian who chronicled the siege, wrote, "Thus the Romans, long accustomed to abundance, now endured thirst. The fountains were as tombs of the dead." It is a haunting phrase, tombs of the dead. The aqueducts, once symbols of civilization, had become monuments to its fragility. After the fall, when the siege ended, the aqueducts were never fully restored. Rome, once a metropolis of over 1 million souls, shrank to a village of perhaps 30 Zarosan. Many of the old channels lay in ruin, their conduits filled with debris and earth. Weeds grew between the joints of ancient arches. The Aqua Virgo, spared by the Goths, continued to trickle into the Campus Martius, feeding a handful of fountains. It would survive the centuries, its course later reclaimed by Renaissance engineers to power the Trevi fountain. But most of the others, the Claudia, the Annio Novus, the Marcia, fell silent. Medieval Rome survived not by its aqueducts but by its wells. The Romans of that era spoke of the great arches in wonder, unsure of their true purpose. Some believed them to be remnants of the flood, others works of giants. It is difficult to imagine now the people who once lived amidst the ruins of the world's greatest plumbing system, drawing water from hand-dug pits. The afterlife of stone even in ruin, the aqueducts refused to disappear. Their stones were quarried for new churches and walls. The Pont du Gard in Gaul became a medieval bridge. Segovia's aqueduct in Spain carried water until the 19th century. In Rome, entire sections of the Aqua Claudia were repurposed as foundations for towers and fortresses. The aqueduct that once fed emperors' baths now supported the ambitions of barons. Yet the structure endured. Travelers from the north entering the city centuries later wrote of their awe upon seeing the long rows of arches stretching across the plain. Massive, useless, and eternal. The poet Petrarch stood before them in the 14th century and wrote, "I see the bones of Rome, yet not her soul." He was right, the aqueducts were bones, remnants of an empire whose lifeblood had been water. Rediscovery and renewal. In the Renaissance, Rome rediscovered its thirst. Engineers studied ancient texts, among them Frontinus's treatise De Aqueductu Urbis Romae, which had survived in monastery libraries. Guided by his records, they traced the buried channels and rebuilt sections of the old aqueducts. In 1570, Pope Pius V restored part of the Aqua Virgo to supply new fountains. Later, Pope Sixtus V commissioned the Aqua Felice, modelled after the ancient system. The art of directing water was reborn. Fountains once again murmured in the city squares. Artists sculpted water into angels and dolphins, shells and lions' mouths. The sound of flow returned to Rome, not as necessity but as beauty. It was, in its way, a resurrection. But even then, the old logic of maintenance remained. The city hired inspectors, labourers, plasterers, the same cast of characters that had toiled beneath emperors. The pipes changed, the rulers changed, but the work did not. Rome could not exist without people to keep its water moving. The philosophy of maintenance. If you were to walk along the ruins of the Aqua Claudia today, you would find its arches still standing, moss-covered, sun-bleached. Their shadows stretching across fields once filled with farms. Birds nest in the crevices where lime once clung. The wind whistles through the broken conduits. There is something profoundly human about these ruins. They are not the remains of conquest, nor of glory. They are the remains of maintenance. Empires are often remembered for their wars and rulers, but Rome's truest monument was its infrastructure. 1,000 tiny acts of upkeep repeated across centuries. A crack patched, a leak sealed, a conduit measured. Each repair was a gesture of defiance against decay. The aqueducts remind us that civilization is not built once. It is built daily, maintained through habits of care and patience. They are, in a sense, the most boring of Rome's achievements, and perhaps the most profound. For what sustains us, after all, is not the glory of our architecture, but the quiet persistence that keeps it standing. The water returns today. Water still flows into Rome from distant hills, through pipes and channels that trace the paths of their ancient predecessors. It no longer arrives by gravity alone. Modern pumps assist, but the principle remains the same. When you toss a coin into the Trevi fountain, you are participating in a ritual older than the empire itself. The water that splashes your coin may have traveled the same route as it did 2,000 years ago, guided by Roman hands, patched with Roman plaster. The continuity is astonishing and humbling. For centuries, the water flowed through darkness and stone, indifferent to politics, to kings, to time. It is, perhaps, the most enduring metaphor of civilization, silent, unseen, but essential. The Romans built their empire on this simple faith, that if water could be made to flow, order could be maintained. And when it stopped, so too did Rome. Reflection. As the arches fade into twilight and the hills of Lazio darken, you might imagine standing beneath the ruins of the Aqua Claudia. The last light catches the curve of ancient stone, the air cool and still. Somewhere faintly, you might almost hear the whisper of water that once was. The Roman aqueducts endure not as monuments to glory, but to endurance itself. They remind us that civilization is not measured in triumphs, but in its capacity to sustain the mundane. The slow, repetitive labor that keeps the world from falling apart. In the end, Rome's greatness was not that it built aqueducts, but that it maintained them for so long. And perhaps that is the true legacy of empire, not conquest, not art, but the quiet, continuous effort to keep things flowing. If the Great Wall was China's defense, the Grand Canal was its bloodstream. It carried not soldiers, but grain, not glory, but sustenance. And like all great arteries of empire, it was built less by inspiration than by persistence, shovelful by shovelful, mile by mile. You can imagine it, endless lines of workers under the pale sky, the dull glint of iron spades, the murmuring of orders, and the slow, rhythmic scrape of earth. It was not a project of genius alone. It was a project of endurance. The dream of connection. China's geography has always been both its blessing and its curse. The fertile plains of the south grew rice in abundance, while the arid north, home to the capital and military garrisons, struggled to feed itself. The Yellow River, unpredictable and prone to flooding, ran west to east. The Yangtze flowed in the south, parallel but distant. What was missing was a link, a way to move the grain that sustained armies and bureaucrats from one region to another without relying on treacherous land routes. As early as the 5th century BCE, small canals connected rivers for local transport, but the vision of a single continuous waterway, a man-made river stretching across the heart of China, came much later, under the Sui dynasty in the 7th century CE. The emperor behind it, Yangdi of Sui, was not remembered fondly. He was extravagant, ambitious, and ultimately doomed. But he had the temperament of a builder. He wanted unity, not just political unity, but hydraulic unity. And so, in the year 605 CE, he ordered the construction of what would become the Grand Canal, a waterway eventually stretching nearly 800 kilometers from Hangzhou in the south to Beijing in the north. The labor begins. No project of that scale could be undertaken by machines or by choice. It required people, thousands upon thousands of them. The records vary, but some chronicles claim that over 5 million laborers were conscripted during the early stages of construction. Most were farmers drawn from their fields. Their names entered into the imperial rolls. They were promised food, coin, and exemption from other taxes. But the work was backbreaking. Many were sent hundreds of miles from home. They lived in temporary camps of straw and mud, sleeping beside the half-dug channels, their days dictated by the clang of overseers' bells. The work itself was simple, almost monotonous. Dig, move the dirt, shape the embankment, pack it with reeds and clay. Repeat. The tools were primitive: shovels, baskets, wooden planks for leveling, and iron blades for cutting through rock. But what they lacked in technology, they compensated for in numbers and patience. The canal grew not as a single grand trench, but as hundreds of smaller segments, each assigned to different provincial governors. When one section met another, it was adjusted by hand. A few degrees of angle corrected by engineers with strings, rods, and water levels carved from bamboo. In the imperial archives, one engineer described the process. "We followed the line of the water as it wished to flow, not as we wished to command it." It was a rare humility in a project born of imperial decree. The bureaucracy of water behind the sweat of the workers was a mountain of paperwork. Before the first shovel struck the earth, the Ministry of Public Works had compiled surveys, drawn maps, and dispatched inspectors. The logistics were staggering, coordinating grain rations, labor rotations, and transport of timber and stone across thousands of li. The imperial bureaucracy ran on documents, each sealed with red wax, each carried by courier on horseback to the next provincial office. One surviving record lists the daily consumption of rice for the laborers of a single canal section. For each worker, 2 measures of rice, 1 of millet, 1 cup of salted vegetables, and a half pint of wine. Even the most routine aspects of life were quantified, standardized, and entered into registers. The empire was built not only by shovels, but by clerks. And they too, in their own quiet way, shaped the canal by ensuring that each worker had food, each supervisor had orders, and each province could report progress to the capital. Without paperwork, the water would not flow. The cost of ambition for Emperor Yangdi. The canal was not just a means of moving grain. It was a symbol of power. He envisioned himself traveling along it in a golden barge, accompanied by thousands of boats carrying tribute from the provinces. But the cost was immense. Floods consumed entire work camps, disease spread through stagnant pools, supply chains faltered. The Book of Sui records that tens of thousands died in a single year of construction. The emperor visited the works often, issuing decrees for faster progress, finer embankments, and more elaborate locks. He never saw the exhaustion in the eyes of the men who dug, nor the quiet despair of the peasants whose fields had become staging grounds for his vision. And yet, despite the suffering, the canal advanced. It was a kind of momentum that could not be stopped. the inertia of empire itself. Completion and consequence. By 6010 CE, the Grand Canal linked the capital at Luoyang with the fertile rice fields of the south. Barges loaded with grain, silk, and tea began to glide northward, while timber and military supplies moved south. The waterway quickly became the empire's economic backbone. Along its banks rose new towns and warehouses. Inns appeared where ferrymen rested. Markets formed where barges stopped. An entire world emerged from the still water, but for Yangdi it was too late. His empire, drained by endless construction and rebellion, collapsed within a decade. He died in exile, murdered by his own men. The canal, however, endured. It became the inheritance of the Tang and later the Song, the slow river that tied China together long after the Sui were dust. The boring glory of success. The Grand Canal did not dazzle like a palace, nor defend like a wall. Its grandeur was invisible. Its greatness measured not in height or decoration, but in the quiet efficiency of its flow. Every empire dreams of permanence. The sea, though short-lived, built something that outlasted their dynasty, their politics, even their memory. And yet, the work never truly ended. For every emperor who inherited the canal, there came the same set of problems: silt that gathered at the bends, locks that warped under pressure, levees that leaked in spring floods. The same dull labor, generation after generation, maintaining, dredging, rebuilding. A canal, like civilization, is never complete. The Grand Canal became both lifeline and burden, a thing that required constant attention, endless maintenance, and the patient rhythm of those who worked upon it. But what was life like for the people who lived along its banks? The lock keepers, the grain boat captains, the families who grew up beside its water. What did the canal mean to them? Beyond the empire's need for order and supply, by the time of the Tang dynasty, the Grand Canal was no longer just a construction project. It was a living landscape, a ribbon of motion that pulsed through the heart of China. What had begun as an imperial ambition became, through the centuries, a quiet, ceaseless routine. Grain boats moving north, empty barges drifting south, ferrymen calling through the fog, and entire towns humming with the rhythm of water and trade. The canal did not conquer, it endured, and it was kept alive not by emperors, but by ordinary people, those who lived, worked, and aged beside its flow. The lock keepers and the boatmen. The canal was a thing of precise management. Every few li, a lock gate was maintained, a simple mechanism of timber and rope designed to raise or lower water levels as barges passed between sections of different elevation. Each lock had its keeper, usually an older man with a government-issued permit and a small house beside the water. His duty was endless and unremarkable: to watch the gates, open them, close them, and monitor the depth with a bamboo pole marked by hand. In official records, these men were known as men who show, literally, guardians of the gate. Their tools were minimal: a lever for the sluice beams, a hammer for the hinges, a hook for pulling debris. Their pay was equally modest: a few strings of copper coins each month, supplemented by a small share of tolls collected from passing barges. Many of them lived and died by the same lock, their names entered in brittle ledgers in provincial archives, now long lost to time. They were neither rich nor poor, neither free nor enslaved, simply part of the mechanism, like the gate itself. The boatmen, by contrast, lived in constant motion. Their craft, long low barges built of pine and elm, carried grain, tea, porcelain, silk, and sometimes soldiers. They worked in crews of 6 to 12, sleeping in narrow compartments, cooking on small clay stoves at the bow. In summer the sun beat down upon them, in winter the water froze, halting travel for months. They were paid by the journey, not by the hour. A dangerous economy: for a storm, a broken rudder, or a flooded lock could delay a trip for weeks. Yet, despite the hardship, boatmen formed a proud subculture, known for their songs, their tattoos, and their independence. A Tang official once wrote disapprovingly, "The men of the canal are coarse and restless. They eat as wolves and sing as if to chase ghosts away." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps that was how they survived the monotony of the current. The grain tribute system, the Grand Canal's true purpose was not commerce but control. Every year, the state collected vast quantities of rice from the fertile southern provinces. The grain tributes, Koyun. This grain was not for the people who grew it, but for the army, the capital, and the court. It was transported north along the canal in enormous convoys of barges. Each convoy was supervised by imperial officials, their boats bearing red banners with golden seals. The logistics were staggering. To feed the capital for a year required nearly 4 million dan of grain, enough to fill tens of thousands of barges. At every major port, warehouses lined the banks. great wooden halls where the grain was measured, taxed, and sealed. The ledgers of the Grain Transport Bureau recorded every sack. Losses due to spoilage or theft were meticulously noted and punished. To the empire, the canal was a bloodstream. To the people, it was a vein through which their labor drained northward. Still, the canal brought opportunities. The towns along its banks, Yangzhou, Suqi, and Huayan Linking, flourished as hubs of commerce and culture. Markets sprang up where convoys paused, selling rope, timber, food, and tools. Boat repair yards worked day and night. Blacksmiths forged anchors rope. Makers twisted hemp by lamplight. The canal may have been built by command, but it was sustained by trade. Life along the banks, to live by the canal was to live by rhythm. At dawn the water was still, the mists low and white. You could hear the first bells from passing barges, signaling their movement through the fog. Fishermen cast nets from the shallows, while women washed rice or linen at the banks. Children played on the towpaths, chasing the laboring oxen that pulled the barges upstream. The animals' hooves sank into the mud, their drivers calling encouragement with short, rhythmic cries. By midday, the sun glinted off the water. Boatmen cooked rice over small fires, their smoke rising in thin, grey spirals. The smell of soy and vinegar drifted across the canal. At dusk, the sound changed. The creak of oars slowed, the clatter of chains softened. Lanterns flickered on the decks, reflected in the black water. It was not a place of peace, but of routine, a human ecosystem built around flow. Every few miles stood a canal temple, dedicated to the gods of water and passage. The most revered was the Dragon King, guardian of rivers and rain. Boatmen offered him incense and paper coins before each voyage. If a journey ended safely, they would stop again to give thanks. Superstition filled the spaces where bureaucracy could not reach. The bureaucrats of the flow, the canal may have appeared natural, but it was managed with near military precision. Every section fell under a regional office of the Canal Transport Bureau, overseen by a governor known as the Yunshi. His duties included supervising repairs, preventing theft, and ensuring the safe passage of grain shipments. These officials corresponded constantly with the capital, sending reports written on bamboo slips or thin paper, sealed with cinnabar paste. One surviving order from the Song era reads, "A rise of 3 chai in the Huai River requires immediate opening of the secondary sluices. Delay will result in overflow and punishment by loss of rank." The language was bureaucratic, but beneath it lay urgency. A clogged canal meant famine in the capital. A late delivery meant unpaid soldiers. The empire depended on paperwork as much as it did on water, yet bureaucracy, like silt, accumulated. As centuries passed, records became tangled, orders delayed, and officials more interested in preserving their rank than in keeping the water moving. The canal, like the empire it served, required constant dredging, not only of mud, but of inefficiency. Towns of transients, the canal's busiest towns, were both vibrant and temporary in spirit. Merchants came and went with the seasons. Workers followed the flow of grain. Inns filled and emptied overnight. A traveller passing through Yangzhou in the 9th century described the city as a place where the streets smell of oil and tar, and the people speak every tongue under heaven. It was true. The canal brought north and south together, not just in goods, but in language, cuisine, and culture. The accents of Fujian mixed with those of Shandong. Boats from Suzhou carried not only silk but songs. Artisans traded tools for poems, and monks offered blessings in exchange for rice. For many, the canal was not a route but a life, a slow, floating civilization of its own. But below that surface of movement, something deeper stirred. The canal that unified China also created new tensions, between those who produced the grain and those who consumed it, between labor and privilege, between the steady rhythm of the workers and the restless ambition of the court. For now, the water still flowed, but the centuries were long, and dynasties, like rivers, changed their course. As the Song emperors looked north, they would find the canal both their greatest strength and their most fragile link, a channel that could be blocked, invaded, or stolen by time. The question was not how to build it, but how to keep it alive. The Grand Canal endured for over 1,000 years, longer than any single dynasty that ruled over it. But like all rivers, its story is not one of triumph, but of gradual decline, of silt, neglect, and time. By the late Ming dynasty, the canal had become both a wonder and a burden. It still stretched over 700 kilometers, linking the fertile rice fields of the south with the capital in the north. But its heart was heavy with sediment, and its edges were worn by centuries of passage. The empire depended on it, and that dependency would be both its strength and its undoing. The burden of the grain fleet each spring, the the grain tribute convoys still set out from Hangzhou, moving northward like a slow tide. Thousands of barges formed a floating procession, their decks loaded with rice sealed in straw-wrapped bundles, their flags bearing the crimson marks of imperial authority. The lead ships carried armed guards, for pirates still haunted certain stretches, especially near the marshes of Lake Goyu. Behind them came the workboats manned by sweating laborers, their oars creaking in rhythm. For the men aboard, it was monotonous work. Days passed with the endless churn of brown water, the same cries of the helmsman, the same meals of boiled millet and salted fish. They slept on straw mats beneath low wooden roofs, wrapped in blankets damp with mist. In the humid summer months, mosquitoes gathered in thick clouds. In winter, ice formed on the hulls, cracking underfoot as the men hauled ropes through frozen mud. Yet, without them, the capital would starve. Every bowl of rice served in Beijing, then Yuan-Daidu, later Ming Beijing, owed its existence to this chain of human endurance. In the words of one 15th century bureaucrat, the people of the canal are unseen yet vital. Their sweat is the salt of empire. But still, few of them would ever be remembered by name. The engineers of silt and stone, as dynasties rose and fell, one constant remained: the canal required maintenance. It had to be dredged, repaired, and reinforced each year to survive the monsoons and the inevitable silting of the riverbeds. During the Yuan dynasty, 1271–1368, the Mongols expanded the canal northward to link directly to their capital at Dadu. It was a feat of monumental engineering, rerouting entire rivers to ensure the emperor's grain arrived unspoiled. But the Mongol emperors did not always understand the subtleties of Chinese hydrology. Their massive earthworks often flooded nearby villages or destroyed fertile fields. Entire towns were relocated in the name of imperial efficiency. By contrast, the Ming engineers who followed them were masters of patience. They developed systems of side sluices and spillways that redirected excess water into controlled reservoirs, preventing floods. The Grand Canal under the Ming became a living machine of regulation, part nature, part human design. Still, silt was relentless. Every year, millions of cubic feet of it gathered in the channel, thickening the flow, raising the riverbed. Laborers, Yonggong, were conscripted by the tens of thousands to shovel it out. They worked waist deep in the murky water, their shovels wooden, their feet bleeding from the submerged stones. A Ming report from 1574 describes one such repair site. 10,000 men labor with buckets and baskets, passing the mud from hand to hand like ants moving earth. The stench of rot is strong. The overseers beat gongs to keep rhythm. It was, perhaps, the most important and least celebrated act of empire, the annual cleaning of the waterway. The bureaucracy of flow, no machine can function without its administrators. By the 16th century, the canal was governed by an immense bureaucracy. There were inspectors for tolls, registrars for boats, surveyors for bridges, tax collectors for grain, and clerks for correspondence. Every lock had its logbook. Every shipment had its official stamp. Even the smallest delay required forms to be filed, stamped, and relayed up the chain of command, sometimes traveling weeks before reaching the capital. A single misplaced record could halt the flow of goods along hundreds of kilometers. In an account from the veritable records of the Ming, one frustrated official wrote, "The water flows faster than the paper. The empire may starve before the orders arrive." It was a perfect symbol of late imperial China, a system vast enough to control everything, yet too slow to adapt. When corruption seeped in, as it inevitably did, the canal's arteries began to clog. Officials embezzled funds meant for dredging. Contractors substituted poor materials. Locks collapsed for want of repair, and the water, indifferent to human authority, began to find new paths. The flood years, the greatest enemy of the Grand Canal was not neglect, but nature itself. The Yellow River, infamous for its unpredictable course, crossed the canal in several places. When it flooded, as it often did, it brought ruin. In 1642, during the collapse of the Ming dynasty, the Yellow River overflowed its banks near Kaifeng, destroying hundreds of miles of the canal's infrastructure. Bridges were swept away, locks shattered, and entire towns submerged beneath waves of silt and water. For months, the imperial grain fleet was stranded. The capital's reserves dwindled. In the chaos, rebel armies rose, taking advantage of the government's paralysis. The canal, once the artery of the empire, had become its wound. After the Qing dynasty seized power in 1644, they inherited not only a broken empire but a broken waterway. The early Qing emperors invested heavily in repair, dredging, rebuilding, and fortifying. Under the reign of Kangxi and Qianlong, the canal once again became functional, though never as efficient as before. The Emperor Qianlong himself traveled its length in 1757, aboard a gilded dragon barge, proclaiming, "The waterway is the thread that binds heaven's realm. May it never be severed." But even as he spoke, the canal's decline had already begun. Steam, rail, and obsolescence. By the 19th century, the world was changing. Foreign ships now docked at coastal ports, carrying goods faster and cheaper than the slow barges of the canal. The invention of the steam engine and the construction of railways offered new paths of trade and transport. The canal, once a symbol of imperial coordination, became an anachronism. Beautiful, but inefficient, the Qing government tried to adapt. They authorized steamboats on certain stretches, but the canal's shallow waters and narrow locks made them impractical. Silt, once again, won the battle. By the early 20th century, the grain tribute system had ended. The Grand Canal no longer carried the empire's sustenance. Instead, it became a relic, a quiet waterway for local transport, irrigation, and memory. The villages along its banks persisted, but their rhythm changed. The songs of the boatmen faded, replaced by the mechanical hiss of trains passing nearby. Where once grain convoys drifted northward, now water lilies spread across stagnant pools. A river remembered today, much of the Grand Canal still exists, though reshaped, rerouted, and in places reborn. Parts of it remain in use for transport, others serve as irrigation channels or heritage sites. In 2014, UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, not for its beauty or majesty, but for its persistence. It remains the longest artificial river in the world, a living monument to the patience of countless generations. The emperors who ordered it are long gone. The boatmen who steered its grain fleets have no graves marked with their names. The engineers who calculated its curves are dust, yet the water still moves inch by inch, through fields and towns, through the same valleys it once carved. If you stand on its banks at dusk, when the last light dims and the frogs begin to sing, you can almost hear it. The faint creak of a wooden barge, the echo of oars, the distant murmur of men calling through the mist. The canal is not dead, it has simply slowed. And perhaps that is the fate of all great works of empire, to endure quietly long after ambition has passed, long after anyone remembers who first ordered the water to flow. When people speak of empires, they speak of armies, emperors, and conquest. But the Han Empire of ancient China, that long, measured rhythm of 2,000 years past, was not built on conquest alone. It was built on paperwork. Every coin minted, every grain of rice taxed. Every cart on the road to the capital was written down, counted, copied, sealed, and stored. To the outside eye, it may have seemed lifeless. Rows of clerks hunched over bamboo strips, dipping brushes into ink, whispering numbers. But this quiet labor, this administrative hum, was the true engine of the Han world. Before roads, before walls, before the silk that crossed the western deserts, there was the record. And in that record, the empire learned to see itself. The foundations of bureaucracy. The Han dynasty rose in 206 BCE, after the collapse of the short-lived Qin. The Qin had unified China but ruled it with iron. They built walls, standardized laws, and crushed dissent, yet their empire lasted barely 15 years. When Liu Bang, a peasant turned rebel, seized the throne and became Emperor Gaozu, he inherited not just the Qin's lands but their system of governance, a vast, rigid network of officials, tax registers, and penal codes. He could not destroy it. So, instead, he softened it. The Qin had relied on fear, the Han would rely on procedure. The state would not thunder, it would whisper on paper. The tools of the clerk. Imagine the office of a Han bureaucrat. It is not grand. A low building of timber and tile, its floor littered with split bamboo strips bound by cord. The air smells of ink, wax, and damp straw. The clerk sits cross-legged, his brush poised above a thin wooden tablet. The brush is made of animal hair, the ink from soot and pine oil. Each stroke must be deliberate. Mistakes are costly, bamboo is precious, and every line must be legible to his superior. He copies decrees, records tax collections, and drafts reports to the prefect. He does this day after day, year after year. Each tablet he fills is added to a bundle. Each bundle is stacked into a chest. Each chest is sealed and labeled with the date and office. These records will travel, by horse, by river, by foot, to the provincial capital, then to the imperial archive in Chang'an, where thousands more like it are stored in halls of red lacquer and polished stone. Together, they form the nervous system of the empire. Through them, the emperor can see, not with his eyes, but with ink. The administrative pyramid, the Han system, was meticulously hierarchical. At the base stood the local magistrate Kai Einling, who oversaw a county of perhaps 20,000 souls. He collected taxes, judged disputes, and enforced laws. Above him was the prefectural governor, Taishou, responsible for several counties. He was appointed by the central government and could be dismissed at will. Above the prefectures were the commanderies, vast regions governed by men of tested virtue and ability. And above them all, in the capital, stood the 3 excellencies and 9 ministers, the highest officials beneath the emperor himself. Every order moved downward through this structure. Every report flowed upward in return. By the time a single land dispute reached the emperor's court, it might have passed through 6 or 7 levels of review, each adding annotations, seals, and summaries in neat brushstrokes. It was bureaucracy at its purest, slow, deliberate, and almost obsessively detailed. The language of power in the Han world. To write was to rule. The empire's official language, classical Chinese, was concise yet flexible, capable of both poetry and command. To the untrained eye, government documents appeared as little more than columns of symbols, but to the bureaucrat, every stroke carried weight. A misplaced brush mark could change a tax from rice to labor, a punishment from exile to death. To be a scribe was to possess power, not visible power like a general or minister, but quiet authority. Many were sons of scholars, trained from childhood to memorize the Confucian classics. Confucius had said, "The ruler governs through the rectification of names." The Han took this literally. To rule was to name correctly, to record precisely, to ensure that titles, taxes, and punishments all matched their proper categories. A wrongly labeled shipment of grain was not simply an error. It was an affront to cosmic order. The census of the empire. Every few years, imperial officials conducted a census, a vast undertaking across the length and breadth of China. Local magistrates recorded every household, the number of men and women, the acreage of fields, the number of oxen, the tools owned, even the trees. Copies were made, one for the local archives, one for the prefectural office, one for the capital. The data was used to calculate taxes and labor quotas, but more than that, it was the empire's way of knowing itself. From these numbers, the emperor's advisors could estimate how many soldiers could be raised, how much grain could be stored, and how far a rebellion might spread before winter. It was governance through arithmetic, and yet these censuses were never fully accurate. Villagers hid families to avoid taxation. Officials falsified data to appear more efficient. Draughts erased entire populations before the figures reached the capital. Still, the illusion of precision was enough. The act of counting, more than the count itself, sustained the sense of control. Punishments and promotions. In theory, the Han bureaucracy was a meritocracy, officials promoted through examinations and moral reputation. In practice, it was a careful dance of patronage and fear. A single lost document could destroy a career. A missing grain shipment might lead to a public flogging. The archives of the Han are full of chillingly calm reports. The magistrate of Pinyuan failed to deliver 2,000 measures of millet. His rank is stripped, and he is sent to the border. The scribe of Huaiyang misplaced 3 seals. He is to be caned 40 times. Yet, despite the harshness, the bureaucracy endured because it gave men purpose. For every demotion there was a promotion, for every punishment, an opportunity. To rise from clerk to prefect was to gain immortality in the ledgers of the state. The silence of the archives. In Chang'an, the imperial capital, the archives were vast. Miles of corridors filled with chests of bamboo strips, sealed with lacquer and marked in cinnabar ink. Few were ever read again after being filed. Some documents contained the daily records of grain shipments, others preserved minutes of council meetings or copies of imperial edicts. To modern eyes, it might seem meaningless, an ocean of ink about taxes, rainfall, and rice. But to the Han, this was civilization itself. In a world of shifting warlords and fading dynasties, the archive was permanence. To write something down was to fix it in time, to make it real, stable, eternal. The empire was not a map of land, but a map of records. Every village, every person, every punishment existed twice, once in reality and once on paper. When the real faded, the written remained. And so, the clerks wrote, the ink flowed, the ledgers filled. The Han Empire, vast as it was, relied not on swords or armies, but on the quiet persistence of those who copied, counted, and corrected. They were not heroes, they were functionaries. But without them, the empire would have dissolved into chaos and silence. The question, however, lingered in every corner of those archives. What happens when an empire built on order becomes overwhelmed by its own records? The empire of the Han had grown vast, too vast, perhaps, for even the emperor to fully comprehend. By the 1st century BCE, it stretched from the jungles of the south to the deserts of the north, from the Korean peninsula to the passes of the Tarim Basin. Its borders were defined by mountain and river, but its true reach was measured not in distance, but in documentation. Every command, every tax, every punishment left its trace. It was said that the empire's archives contained so much bamboo that entire forests vanished to supply the scribes. And yet, the machine worked, slow, deliberate, and tireless. For centuries, the Han state turned the labor of millions into a steady rhythm of ink and decree. The flow of orders, a single imperial edict might take weeks to reach the provinces. It began in the palace secretariat, dictated by an imperial advisor and written in flowing, formal script. Copies were made, one for each relevant ministry, one for the archives, and one for the emperor's personal records. From the capital at Chang'an, couriers carried the document along the imperial post roads. A network of stations spaced every 15 to 30 li's, roughly 5 to 10 miles. At each stop, horses were changed, and new riders took the sealed orders onward. Every station master kept his own logs. Times of arrival, condition of seals, weather noted, and the name of each courier. The order moved like blood through arteries of dirt and stone. By the time it reached a provincial office, the document bore multiple seals and marginal notes, proof that it had survived the journey intact. The recipient, often a local governor, would gather his staff of clerks and scribes. Together, they would read the edict aloud, transcribe it onto new bamboo slips, and distribute copies to the counties under their rule. Every repetition multiplied the state's voice, a whisper echoing across the plains and valleys, until it became a chorus of administration. And when the governor's report finally returned to the capital, weeks or months later, it joined millions of others. A tide of information that fed the emperor's illusion of omniscience. The economics of the ledger, the heart of the bureaucracy, was not war, but revenue. Every farmer owed taxes in grain and labor. Every merchant paid duties on silk, salt, and iron. Every family contributed men to public works, roads, canals, granaries. The local magistrate's duty was to record all of it. His ledgers were organized by household, age, and occupation. A single line might read, House of Zhou Ping, 3 adult males, 2 females, 120 mu of land, 2 oxen, 4 trees, 2 sons in service. Another line, House of Liu Shen, widowed, no fields, 1 loom, exempted from tax by decree of year 9. That each entry was precise, impersonal, and binding. Once entered into the record, it became reality, even if a man died, even if his land flooded, even if a widow remarried. The paper did not change. It was through these ledgers that the Han state extracted its lifeblood, and when officials gathered in the Ministry of Finance, surrounded by bamboo chests stacked to the ceiling, they could measure the pulse of the empire in numbers. The bushels of grain stored in state granaries, the weight of iron ingots from frontier foundries, the number of households conscripted for the spring harvest. The empire was not imagined as a nation, but as a balance sheet. Granaries and the politics of storage, the Han were masters of foresight, at least in theory. They knew that control over food was control over people. Throughout the empire, state granaries stood as silent fortresses of stability, huge, elevated warehouses built of timber and brick, their floors raised above ground to prevent rot. Officials kept meticulous records of deposits and withdrawals dates, quantities, moisture levels, and even the temperature of the air. The ever-normal granary system, as later scholars would call it, was designed to regulate prices. When harvests were good, the state bought surplus grain at low prices, storing it for lean years. When famine struck, it sold the grain back at a controlled rate, preventing social unrest. In practice, corruption was inevitable. Local officials falsified records, siphoned grain to the black market, or inflated their stock figures to appear diligent. Yet the concept endured, a triumph of bureaucracy over nature. In quiet seasons, the granary keepers would sweep the floors, mend the bins, and record the year's yield on slender slips of bamboo, words that might outlast the food they described. The examination of the faithful to keep the machine running, the empire required a steady flow of competent officials. Thus, the civil service examinations began to take form, crude at first, but revolutionary in idea. Candidates were tested on their knowledge of law, arithmetic, and especially the Confucian classics. Success promised entry into the lower ranks of administration. Failure meant a return to obscurity. Examiners were appointed by the Ministry of Personnel. Each candidate's test was reviewed, annotated, and sealed with red wax. The process could take months. For many families, the dream of officialdom became an obsession. A son who passed the examination not only elevated himself, but his entire lineage. Thus, the bureaucratic class became hereditary in spirit if not in law. Fathers training sons, teachers grooming pupils, villagers pooling resources to educate a single promising boy. To master the language of the state was to master fate itself. The empire's stability depended less on the sword than on the brush, on a generation of scholars who believed that virtue and paperwork could sustain the world. The network of spies and reporters, no bureaucracy survives on obedience alone. The Han rulers understood this, and so they built an invisible layer into the system: inspectors and informants. These men, often eunuchs or trusted courtiers, traveled in secret to assess provincial governance. They visited offices unannounced, checked ledgers, compared figures, and interviewed locals. Their reports were sent directly to the emperor, bypassing the normal administrative hierarchy. A single negative report could end a governor's career. A favorable one could elevate a minor official to prominence. To the empire's citizens, it meant constant surveillance. Every warehouse, every toll station, every granary was watched. Even in the smallest county, the magistrate knew that unseen eyes might be reading his reports. In this way, the Han state maintained its grip not through open terror, but through the quiet, relentless pressure of oversight. When records become reality over time, the empire began to confuse its documents with the world they described. If a flood destroyed a county, but the report said otherwise, the county still existed in the imperial ledger. If a farmer fled famine but remained on the tax rolls, he was still expected to pay. This dissonance grew with the centuries. The more perfect the paperwork became, the less flexible the reality beneath it. Some scholars in later generations would call it the illusion of order, the idea that an empire could function by its records alone, even as the land eroded and people starved. But for now, in the heart of the Han, the system still held. The numbers matched well enough. The rice reached the capital. The emperor's court remained fed and clothed. The illusion, after all, was convincing. The human coast, the clerks who maintained this order lived lives of quiet exhaustion. They rose before dawn, worked by lamplight, and seldom left their posts. Their fingers were stained with ink, their eyes ruined by the tiny strokes of endless characters. Their lives were small but essential, anonymous threads in the fabric of empire. A minor scribe once wrote in his diary, found centuries later in a tomb near Dunhuang, "The ink dries faster than I can write. The rice ration is small, the overseer cruel. But when I brush the emperor's decree, I feel the pulse of heaven in my hand." That small confession, written on a strip of bamboo, speaks to the strange faith that sustained them, the belief that through order, even the mundane could touch the eternal. Yet beneath the calm flow of ink, cracks were forming. The bureaucracy had become so vast, so heavy, that it began to bend under its own weight. Rebellions would come, records would burn, and the empire would test whether paper could truly hold power. The question remained: when the ledgers turned to ash, what would be left of the empire they described?